Welcome to the furnace of war, where we go beyond the battlefield and into the heat that forged the commanders, the campaigns, and the chaos that shaped history. Today, a professor turned prophet, a man who rode alone, prayed in silence, and marched faster than anyone thought possible. In the spring of 1862, Stonewall Jackson didn't just fight in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, he weaponized it. He confused, outran, and outmaneuvered 3 Union armies, changing the rhythm of the war itself. This is the story of how one man turned movement into strategy, terrain into advantage, and belief into firepower. This is the Valley Campaign. This is the story of how the earth growled beneath us. Stonewall Jackson and the Valley Campaign of 1862. The light was dying in the western sky, bleeding red along the ridgelines, staining the clouds the color of old blood. The valley stretched out below, half in shadow, half in silence. The mountains stood over it like old sentries, watching. Down in the distance, the guns were still talking, low, sullen reports rolling like thunder from Kernstown to Luray. The ground itself seemed restless. It groaned under the weight of men and war, as if it had grown tired of both and was ready to bury them together. A Confederate private wrote home, "The earth was so cold and full of noise, it felt like the whole country was alive and moaning under us." It was March 1862. The war, by every measure, was supposed to be decided on the peninsula. The Union had the numbers, the money, the machinery. General George McClellan had landed over 100,000 men on the Virginia coast, inching toward Richmond with a map in one hand and a telegraph wire in the other. But up in the valley, away from the rail lines and headlines, something else was moving. Something smaller, quieter, faster. His name was Thomas Jonathan Jackson. His men called him Old Jack. Some called him Mad. History would call him Stonewall. But here in the fog and red clay of the Shenandoah, he was just a man on horseback, solitary, unreadable, wrapped in a faded blue cape, a Bible in his saddlebag, orders in his head. "He marched us to death," one soldier would later say, but he marched us to victory. J. Anoyales, Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Valley Campaign. He had just 3,500 men, ragged, hungry, worn thin. But Jackson didn't need a grand army. What he needed was time, for Richmond, for Lee, for the South. What he needed was a stage where the enemy couldn't read the script. So he took the valley. And he didn't just fight in it, he turned it into a weapon, not often anyway. But if he was hard to read, he was harder to follow, and harder still to forget. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was born in the mountains of northwestern Virginia, raised by grief and shaped by hardship. His mother died when he was a boy, his father before that. He was sent off to live with relatives who saw him more as burden than blood. What he didn't receive in affection, he made up for in will. He read obsessively. He studied on his own terms. When he set his sights on West Point, he entered nearly last in his class, but graduated 17th, not because he was brilliant, but because he outworked brilliance. At the academy, he earned a reputation for being earnest to the point of oddness. He kept meticulous notes. He once asked to retake an exam he had passed just to prove he understood the material better than merely enough. An instructor described him as completely unremarkable, except in resolution. That phrase would follow him into history. "He was one of the most singular characters I ever knew," wrote a fellow officer. "He looked like a preacher and rode like a demon. And when he prayed, you'd swear the mountains stood still to listen." P. Causen's Shenandoah, 1862. He first earned his name not in the Shenandoah, but under a Mexican sky, dusty and brutal, lit by cannon fire near Chapultepec. Jackson was a young lieutenant then, commanding a battery under General Winfield Scott in the Mexico City campaign. At Contreras, he drove his guns forward under fire and held the line so stubbornly that senior officers marked his name. At Chapultepec, he held a forward position through relentless enemy fire. He received 2 brevet promotions for gallantry, no small feat in an army that rarely rewarded artillery officers. "A braver man never lived," one officer said. "If anything, he was too brave for his own good." When the war ended, Jackson didn't stay in Washington or chase celebrity. He took a teaching post at Virginia Military Institute, where his manners stiffened even further. Cadets mocked him behind his back. "Old Tom Fool," they called him, mimicking his rigid walk, his stiff salute, and his lectures, delivered straight from memory like scripture. He'd pace the classroom slowly, eyes locked ahead, reciting word for word. If a student asked him to repeat something, Jackson would pause, then start again from the very first sentence. But behind the odd mannerisms was a core of unshakable confidence. "Duty," he told a colleague, "is ours. Consequences are God's." It was there in the brick classrooms of Lexington, and before that, among the shattered walls of Chapultepec, that Jackson first showed the kind of man he would be in the valley: silent, relentless, and unmoved by fear. He believed deeply and without hesitation in Providence, a living, shaping force in the world. To Jackson, every step he took was ordered by God. He prayed before battle. He prayed after. He prayed while riding, alone, his lips moving silently. He refused to worry, convinced that no bullet would end him before heaven allowed it. He also didn't believe in wasting time. "A man who does not move promptly when ordered," Jackson once said, "is guilty of a great crime." J. Selby, Stonewall Jackson as military commander. He was a hard man to serve under. He kept his plans secret, so secret sometimes that even his senior officers had no idea where they were headed until the column turned. He demanded obedience, not explanation. That demand came to a head at Kernstown, his first battle of the campaign. Jackson believed he was attacking a much smaller Union force. In truth, he was outnumbered nearly 3-1. The fight turned hard, confused. One of his brigade commanders, General Richard Garnett, ordered a withdrawal when he believed his men were about to be overwhelmed. The order likely saved lives, but Jackson saw it differently. The next day, he had Garnett arrested and charged with neglect of duty in the face of the enemy. It stunned the army. Garnett was respected. His officers pushed back. But Jackson didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply wrote the order, had it delivered, and rode on. To Jackson, it didn't matter that the retreat had been tactically sound. Orders hadn't been given. And in Jackson's mind, orders came from God through him. To disobey them, even under pressure, was to interrupt divine will. Garnett would never again serve under Jackson. He'd die at Gettysburg, charging across open ground under picket, carrying the weight of a court-martial that was never resolved. But for all his eccentricities, and there were many, Jackson inspired something close to faith in the men who marched behind him. They called him Old Jack, Tom Fool Jackson, even Crazy Tom. But they followed him anyway, through sleet, through hunger, through 30-mile marches on bare feet. "We didn't understand him," one soldier said, "but we knew he understood something, and that was enough." J.R. Robertson, Jr., the Stonewall Brigade. He rode alone, ahead of the column, with that same narrow-eyed stare he gave to everything, as if God had left him a sign somewhere in the dust. His eyes were always squinting. His left arm was said to hang awkwardly. He believed it was longer than his right and kept it raised to improve circulation. Soldiers whispered that he didn't sleep, only sat with his back against a tree and disappeared into prayer. But for all the oddness, he moved. And war, Jackson believed, was not won by theory or eloquence. It was won by motion. Precision. Force delivered where the enemy didn't expect it. And so, when the valley called, Jackson answered. Not with flair, not with speeches, but with silence, scripture, and the sound of marching feet. McClellan moves, and so must we. In the spring of 1862, the Union Army began to move. Not in fury, but in formation, Long lines of blue-coat infantry, artillery wagons, engineers with compasses in hand, surgeons in starched aprons, balloonists with silk and hydrogen, all moving up Virginia's peninsula between the York and James Rivers. Brass bands played as they went, and the earth shook with the weight of 100,000 men. At the head of it all rode George B. McClellan, smart, polished, cautious. He trusted mathematics over momentum, believed in war the way he believed in fortifications, solid, deliberate, and perfectly planned. He studied maps the way other men studied scripture, and on his maps, the Shenandoah Valley was a footnote, a flank, a place to pin down, not to fight for. The war, in McClellan's mind, would be won in Richmond, not along the mountain roads of western Virginia. But Abraham Lincoln wasn't so sure. Washington sat too close to that valley, closer than comfort allowed. In the year before, a Confederate army had swept down from those hills and nearly turned the capital upside down at Manassas. And now there were rumors again. Whispers of movement in the mountains. A name re-emerging like a ghost from the fog. Jackson. "I am fearful," Lincoln wrote. "The enemy has a way of disappearing into those mountains and reappearing where he is least expected. I cannot uncover Washington." Letter to McClellan, April 1st, 1862. Lincoln once said of his general, "If McClellan does not want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while." It was no joke. By the spring of 1862, frustration in Washington had curdled into outright distrust. McClellan had the numbers, over 100,000 men, but moved like a man counting shadows. He demanded more troops, more time, more assurances, even as Lincoln begged him to strike. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton called him a general without war. And so Lincoln, desperate to guard the capital from the ghost of Jackson, began to stitch together a defense from parts that didn't fit. John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, they called him, had mapped the Rockies, run for president, and once been hailed as a future Napoleon. But on the battlefield he was hesitant, unsteady. His staff called him General Headquarters, because that's where he always was. Banks, the former Speaker of the House turned Corps commander, was competent but plodding. His instincts were political. His columns moved slow. Shields, an Irish-born hero of the Mexican War, was brave to the bone, but impulsive and proud. He was wounded in the arm at Kernstown and sent orders from his sickbed. Their commands were split by rivers, ridgelines, and worse, by orders that often arrived too late, or not at all. In June of 1862, Fremont wrote to Stanton asking why Shields had failed to support him. Stanton replied, "Shields was unaware he was expected to move." Fremont fired back, "Had I known I was fighting alone, I might not have chosen the field." Jackson, by contrast, needed no reminder. His orders were blunt. His movement was unified. His subordinates didn't second-guess. They moved, or they were replaced. The contrast was total: a Confederate corps that moved like a single arm, a Union defense built from borrowed tools. So instead of reinforcing McClellan's grand push toward Richmond, Lincoln held men back. He split his strength and scattered it through the valley. General Nathaniel Banks, holding the north around Winchester with more than 20,000 men. General John C. Fremont, westward in the Alleghenies with 15,000 more. And James Shields, recovering from a wound but still tasked with anchoring the Eastern Gap. Together they outnumbered Jackson by 6-1. On paper, it was overwhelming. They believed him cornered, trapped in a cul-de-sac of rock and river. But Jackson wasn't where the map said he was. Not for long. Because Jackson's strength wasn't in position. It was in movement. He would march his men for days, vanish into the folds of the mountains, and then appear 50 miles away with guns drawn. He attacked when he was outnumbered. He retreated when he was ahead. And in every movement, he used the valley the way a swordsman uses distance, not just to defend, but to draw the enemy forward. The valley was a stage, wrote historian A.J. Genetti, and Jackson used geography as theater. Genetti, the influences on Stonewall Jackson's campaign. That valley stretched 120 miles, from Harper's Ferry to Staunton, walled in by the Blue Ridge to the east and the Alleghenies to the west. It was rich in food, riddled with roads, and covered in fog. From it, a commander could strike at Washington or swing south like a hammer toward Richmond. It was both shield and sword, and it was his to command. He started with just 3,500 men, ragged, underfed, thin as smoke, but trained to march and trained to move. They carried little and asked less. They became known, half in pride and half in pain, as the foot cavalry. One officer put it plainly, "We lived off the land, off rumor, and off Jackson's eyes." They marched 30 miles in a day, sometimes more, then fought, then marched again, and they marched quiet. Jackson's army traveled as much in shadow as in daylight, wrote historian David Detweiler. Their true weapon was their general's silence. Detweiler, The Civil War, the story of the war with maps. Then came Kernstown. Jackson believed he was facing a small federal detachment near Winchester. He attacked on a cold Sunday in March, only to discover he was outnumbered 3-1. It was, by measure of casualties and ground, a defeat. But Jackson didn't fight for ground. He fought for reaction. News of the engagement hit Washington like a thunderclap. Lincoln saw not a skirmish, but a Confederate spear point. Within hours, he ordered McDowell's 30,000-man corps, intended to support McClellan's push on Richmond, held back to defend the capital. The valley had done its job. Jackson had pulled 40,000 men away from the main Union offensive, with a force the size of a modern brigade. From that moment forward, he wasn't just defending the valley. He was rewriting the war. He moved like smoke through the folds of the mountains. He would appear at Front Royal, then vanish. Strike Winchester, then turn back around. One Union officer wrote, "We never knew where he was until he was behind us." Jackson's advantage was a thing of perpetual movement, in knowing the ground and in knowing how not to be known. The campaign had begun, not with a triumph, not with a charge, but with misdirection. He wasn't defending the valley. He was using it to unmake Union strategy. And from here on out, the Union wasn't fighting Jackson's army, it was chasing it. Act 3, the foot cavalry rides. They called them the foot cavalry, and not without reason. They moved faster than any army had a right to move. Barefoot sometimes, half-fed often, but always moving. Over rock, through rain, past rivers that had no name but cold. Behind them rode Jackson, cloaked, silent, unreadable. He didn't speak unless pressed. He rarely smiled. He seemed to pray more than he slept. And yet men followed him, because when he moved, things happened. Battles broke loose. Dispatches scattered. Federals ran. They didn't know his plans. He didn't tell them. "He didn't tell us where we were going," one private recalled. "He just looked down the road like he'd already been there." And they believed him. McDowell. He came out of the mountains like a ghost. The campaign began in the high country, McDowell, May 8th, a raw place, all slope and shadow, where the road turned to gravel and the mountains leaned in close on either side. Jackson had marched west to meet General Edward Allegheny Johnson, and together they set their sights on General Robert Milroy, whose Federals had taken up a strong position atop Sitlington's Hill, a ridgeline so steep and snarled with brush that it looked like God had laid it there to keep men out. Jackson sent his men up it anyway. They clawed through brush, tripped over rock, fell, fired, and rose again. Union fire came down like hail on tin, and still they climbed. "The hill smoked like a forge," one Confederate wrote, "and the fire came down like sleet. We cursed the sky and kept going." By twilight, the Union line had bent and pulled back. The battle was won, if barely. And just like that, Fremont, who had been preparing to join McClellan, was pinned fast in the Alleghenies. Lieutenant John Imboden later said, "We could not see the enemy, only the flashes of their guns." By dusk, Milroy was retreating with his wounded in tow, and Jackson's men were counting the dead by lantern. The Union side lost 256 men, the Confederates 420, a bloody field for a minor victory. But Jackson had what he came for. He turned his men east. Front Royal, like thunder from the clouds. 2 weeks later, the foot cavalry was back on the move, heading east across Massanutten Mountain, where rivers ran fast and the roads curled like smoke through the trees. They came through timber and fog, through back roads and brush, and descended on Front Royal like a thunderclap. It was May 23, 1862. Union Colonel John Kenly commanded a garrison of just over 1,000 men in the town of Front Royal, guarding the vital Luray and Manassas Gap Rail Junction. It was a small post, but a key one, a cork in the bottle between Jackson and Banks's main force at Strasburg. Jackson meant to pull that cork. He brought with him 3 brigades, nearly 11,000 men, and used the South Fork of the Shenandoah as a curtain. He kept the bulk of his force hidden behind wooded high ground, pushing only Colonel Flournoy's 6th Virginia Cavalry and a single regiment forward for the initial strike. At 2 p.m., the trap sprang open. Confederates poured out of the woods and hit the Union pickets hard at the south end of town. Flournoy's cavalry raced to cut off the North Road. Jackson sent the 1st Maryland Infantry, CSA, irony not lost, to slam into Kenly's own 1st Maryland, USA, brothers in arms by birth now firing across fences. Kenly fought back fiercely. He withdrew to a stronger position at Richardson's Hill and brought his artillery up. But it was too late. Jackson's men had the flanks. The town was boxed, and Kenly's retreat path, the bridge over the North Fork, was about to collapse under artillery fire. One Confederate private recalled, "It was like watching a chessboard fall to the floor. Pieces in motion, none in command." Kenly ordered a desperate retreat. Some tried to burn the bridge to slow Jackson. It didn't work. Flournoy's cavalry caught them on the run, saber in hand, musket over shoulder, cutting the column in half. The Union force was shredded. Kenly himself was severely wounded and captured. Jackson had taken the town, shattered a regiment, and seized the key supply artery to Banks's rear. The total casualties for both sides, the Union suffered 900, killed, wounded, and captured. The Confederates just 36. But more than the numbers, it was what came next. Banks, still in Strasburg, now faced the real horror. Jackson wasn't south of him anymore. He was behind him. And with Front Royal lost, the road north, the Valley Pike, was his only escape. It was a tactical ambush executed like a cavalry raid, but it landed like a thunderclap in Washington. Gallagher Shenandoah Valley Campaign, 2003. Winchester. He knew when to strike. The morning of May 25, 1862, began with a strange quiet. Union General Nathaniel Banks had taken position south of the town, convinced he could hold the turnpike. He posted artillery on Bowers Hill and stretched his infantry across a mile of broken country, apple orchards, fences, brick farmhouses. A patchwork defense, thin and brittle. Then Jackson came. From the ridgelines near Bartonsville, his men moved like a tide. Ewell's division struck the Union left with speed, moving up from the southeast and firing by volley. On the Confederate right, Jackson's own regiment slammed into the road toward the center. They came screaming, their flags forward. "They fired low," one Union soldier wrote, "and fast, and we couldn't see the line, only the barrels flashing through the smoke." The Union center crumpled first. Then the flanks began to fold. The retreat turned to panic. Wagons jammed the roads out of Winchester. Banks's rear guard tried to hold a stone wall north of town, but Jackson's cavalry flanked them, galloping fast across the fields like outriders of an incoming storm. "We were whipped before we fired the first shot," one Federal wrote, "not by their numbers, but by their momentum." Jackson's men captured 3,000 muskets, 9,000 rounds of ammunition, 100 wagons, and cleared the lower valley of all Federal resistance. His troops marched into Winchester to cheers from local civilians, passing abandoned sutler wagons and strewn haversacks. Jackson and his men inflicted 2,000 causalities to the Union side, while only suffering 400 total losses to their own. Banks fled across the Potomac. The war, at least for that day, was no longer in Virginia. Jackson took the field like a man chasing a vision. He didn't just break a line, he broke a rhythm, a presumption, that this war would be clean or predictable. P. Cozzens, Shenandoah, 1862. Cross Keys and Port Republic. 2 days, 2 battles, 1 commander. By the first week of June 1862, Jackson had done the impossible. He'd outmarched the Union, outfought them, and now they were coming for him. 2 Federal forces, Fremont from the west and Shields from the east, were closing in like pincers. Jackson was caught between the forks of the Shenandoah River near the village of Port Republic. Most generals would have retreated. Jackson split his army. Cross Keys, June 8th. Fremont was moving again from the west. Shields, still aching from defeat, was pressing up from the east. Jackson didn't wait to be caught. He set up his line near Cross Keys, placed his best men, Ewell's division, in the woods behind rolling pasture, with artillery massed behind fences and brush. Fremont, expecting a retreat, came on and walked straight into a trap. Union Brigade General Julius Stahl's brigade advanced in column through open ground. Ewell waited until they were in range, then unleashed musket fire across the front, sporadic, then full. Ewell's line lighting up the woods like dry brush. His artillery punched through the fog, enfilading Stahl's flanks. Fremont's men hit hard but blind, pressing into trees and smoke and a line they couldn't see. Bayonets caught light like silver. Bullets snapped past bark and bone. It was a hard fight, bloody and close. "We buried our faces in the dirt and fired blind," one Union soldier wrote. The woods were a river of smoke and blood. The Union right recoiled. Then the left tried to flank, only to be thrown back by Trimble's counterattack, which drove them nearly 2 miles in pursuit. Trimble begged to keep pushing. Ewell said no. Jackson's orders were clear. Hold them, don't chase them. Time was the objective. And they'd bought it. "It was not a flashy fight," wrote a soldier of the 44th Virginia, "but it was sound, like a door being held shut while the floorboards shook." By nightfall, Fremont was staggering back, the fight knocked out of him. But Jackson was already moving. East now, across the South Fork of the Shenandoah. The next morning, he'd be in Port Republic. Port Republic, June 9th. While Ewell held the west, Jackson moved east. Overnight, his engineers built crude bridges, planks, beams, wagons lashed together by fence wire to get artillery across the rain-swollen South Fork of the Shenandoah. By dawn on June 9th, Jackson launched a surprise attack. Shields' men were just forming up when Jackson struck, hard, fast, and low, cutting them apart. He struck the head of their column before the rear even knew it was engaged. General Erastus Tyler's vanguard, part of Shields' command. Tyler held a strong defensive position on a ridge beyond Lewiston and had artillery in place. Jackson's men had to cross open fields, under fire, through a bottleneck. The first wave, mostly Taylor's Louisianians, was driven back. Jackson reformed the line. He ordered a renewed assault, coordinated this time with support from Winder's brigade and artillery on the flanks. They hit Tyler's line at 10 a.m. The Union right broke first. under sustained musket fire and pressure from Confederate guns on high ground. Shields' line collapsed. Men ran where they could. Some never left the riverbank. By noon, the ridge was taken, and Shields' men were in retreat down the Luray Road. Jackson's army stood alone at Port Republic, bruised, bloodied, but victorious. These were not perfect battles. Cross Keys was conservative. Port Republic was rushed and bloody. But together they shattered the last Federal presence in the valley. Jackson had fought 2 separate armies in 2 days. He moved faster, chose his ground, used bridges and rivers not as obstacles, but as weapons. Closing, the valley was his. The valley was still now, but it wasn't peace. It was that thick hush that comes after a storm's rage, when the creeks swell past their banks and the land holds its breath, waiting to see what the water will bury and what it will let go. In just 7 weeks, Jackson had covered near to 700 miles. He struck 5 times, and every time he struck true, moving with a kind of urgency that felt borrowed from another age entirely. 3 Union armies he pinned down, slicing through the gears of Lincoln's grand design, turning the Shenandoah into a long blade pointed straight at the Capitol's soft ribs. But it wasn't the killing that made it genius. It was what came after. McClellan, with his army camped close enough to hear Richmond's church bells, suddenly found the ground cut out from under him. 30,000 men were yanked away to chase shadows, chasing Jackson through fog and forest, over the same red clay ruts, into those folds of mountains where the line between predator and prey blurred with every step. He never marched on Washington. He didn't need to. He let them think he might, and that was enough. Jackson didn't just hold the valley, Gary Gallagher would say years down the line. He bent it to his will, made it march in step with him, turned geography into cunning, turned speed into silence. And when it ended, when the last shot bounced off the flanks of the Massanuttons and the Bluecoats had vanished, Jackson said nothing. He didn't linger, didn't gloat. He just turned his east and rode toward Richmond. Act 6, The Legacy. He changed the rhythm of the war. The Valley Campaign didn't end when Jackson rode east. It kept echoing through telegraphs, troop deployments, presidential orders, and the haunted minds of Union commanders who never quite figured out how he did it. He'd taken a force that was smaller, worse supplied, and badly outnumbered, and made it look like an army twice its size. He made the Union fight on ground they didn't choose, on timetables they didn't write, and in fear of a ghost that was always one ridge away. He changed the rhythm of the war. Before Jackson, war in the East had followed a script: set-piece battles, linear campaigns, cities as prizes, rivers as barriers. After Jackson, it moved differently, less like chess, more like fire. In 6 weeks, he'd fought 5 battles, marched his men nearly 700 miles, and tied up over 50,000 Union troops, forces that were supposed to be pressing down on Richmond, not chasing Jackson through the folds of the Massanuttons. It was distraction, deception, and destruction rolled into one. It was, according to Lee himself, the most brilliant campaign ever fought on American soil. Gary Gallagher would write later that Jackson didn't just delay the Union war effort, he dislocated it. He turned the valley into a weapon. And in Washington, Lincoln saw it too. He pulled McDowell's corps away from McClellan. He sent orders that contradicted one another. He flooded the Shenandoah with soldiers who never found the man they were hunting until it was too late. And while they did all that, Jackson gave Lee what no general ever has enough of: time. And time in war is everything. With it, Lee built his army. He reorganized command. He prepared for the 7 days. And when McClellan finally moved on Richmond, he found something waiting for him that hadn't been there before: resistance. Jackson gave Lee time, historian Ethan Refuse wrote, and time is what made Lee dangerous. Jackson himself never said much about what he'd done. When asked to explain the Valley Campaign, he reportedly replied, Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy. But it wasn't just mystification. It was clarity. He understood what his enemies didn't, that the valley wasn't a backwater, it was a hinge. And if you pushed it hard enough, it would swing the whole door of the war open, or closed. It gave the South a moment it would never have again. A strategic initiative, a breathing space, a commander no one could catch. Lee would go on to fight his greatest battles with Jackson still at his side. At 2nd Manassas, Harper's Ferry, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, the two men would form one of the most effective command partnerships in military history, one drawing the map, the other moving across it like lightning. But it was in the valley that Jackson became something more than a subordinate. He became a principle of war, a living embodiment of movement, surprise, and relentless pressure. What Lee saw in him there, he would spend the next year depending on. And what the Union learned in those fields and ridges, the fear of what Jackson might do next, never really left them. Act 7, and then he was gone. By the spring of 1863, the war had grown larger, meaner, harder to hold in the hand. It had left the valleys and taken to the cities, the railways, the dead rivers. The armies were bigger now, the losses worse, and the ground soaked deeper in blood. But Jackson was still lean, still silent, still trusted like no other man in gray. And at Chancellorsville, on the evening of May 2nd, he struck one final blow that would ripple across history. It was past 5 o'clock when his corps, more than 28,000 strong, emerged from the woods on the Union right, where Hooker had left it hanging like an open door. Jackson flung it wide. The attack fell like a hammer on the 11th Corps, broke it, scattered it, drove men into the forests and over fences, dropping rifles and packs as they ran. It was lightning without thunder. Even Lee, no stranger to Jackson's gifts, would later call it the most brilliant achievement of military genius in our time. But daylight was fading. The lines were blurred, the forest thick, and Jackson, riding ahead with just a handful of staff to scout the next move, was mistaken for Federal cavalry by his own men posted along the line. The volley came sharp and sudden, 3 shots in the dusk. 2 hit home. One passed through his right hand and into his left arm, shattering the bone. Another struck him in the side. His horse bolted, his staff scattered, and Jackson fell in the tangled underbrush beneath the pines. He was carried from the field in silence, whispering orders the whole way. "Press forward," he kept saying. "Press forward." Surgeons removed his left arm. Lee sent a note. "You have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right." For a time it seemed he might recover. The fever dipped. The wound began to dry. But the pneumonia came next, quiet, heavy. He grew weaker each day, drifting in and out of the war he'd once commanded. He spoke of troop movements, of flanks and batteries. At the end, he asked to be moved from the noise, imagining perhaps that the guns were still close. "Let us cross over the river," he whispered, "and rest under the shade of the trees." He died on May 10th, 1863, at Guinea Station. And the valley, though far from that battlefield, seemed to know. It did not sing for him, did not shout. It remembered him the way the land remembers fire, not with monuments, but with silence. The old roads he marched are still there. The hills he watched from still rise in the distance like folded arms. And in the right season, when the leaves turn and the fog clings low, you might swear the ground still trembles at hoofbeats you can't quite place. He came out of nowhere, just a name from Lexington, just an odd professor. But he moved like he'd been carved for war. He fought like a man chasing a vision, and war itself made room for him. And when he was gone, it was as if a page had been torn from the war, taken away by the wind, forever.